The Galactic Council had a rule about extinct civilizations. They did not mourn them. They cataloged them, assigned them a number, and moved on. There were 4,400 cataloged species in the known galaxy. Most of them were dead. The Council had learned long ago that grief was a luxury that slowed the bureaucracy. Species 7742, the humans, had been added to the extinct list 43 years ago. The file was thin. A single paragraph. A species that had risen from one small blue planet in the Orion Spur had briefly touched the edges of interstellar travel and had then gone quiet. No transmissions, no ships, no signals. One of the Council's survey vessels had passed through the Sol system in the standard sweep and found the planet stripped of its upper atmosphere, orbiting in a permanent ash cloud, its surface temperatures incompatible with carbon-based biology. The Council had stamped the file, moved on. They had 43 years of moving on under their belt when the Keth Empire sent an urgent signal to every seat on the Council. Ambassador Vrail of the Keth did not panic easily. His species had 4 hearts, 2 of which were backups, and a nervous system wired for crisis. He had served in 3 border conflicts, survived a plague that had taken half his homeworld's population, and sat through 1,100 years of council meetings without losing his composure. He was panicking now. The holographic display at the center of the council chamber showed a star map. It showed the Keth's outer border, a region of dense nebula and dead star systems that the council had collectively agreed was worthless. Nobody went there. There was nothing to go there for. Except something was there now. The first detection was 48 hours ago, Vrail said. His voice was steady. His secondary hearts were hammering. Our border station in the Veth corridor picked up a gravity signature. Not natural. We sent a scout. He touched the display. The star map zoomed in. The nebula filled the room, its gas clouds rendered in deep violet and orange, and moving through it slowly, without haste, as if they had all the time in any universe, were ships. Not a fleet, not a squadron. An armada. We count 11,000 individual vessels, Vrail said. The smallest are 1 kilometer in length. The largest, he paused. He had rehearsed this number. He still could not say it without his voice dropping. The largest are 60 kilometers long. The chamber was silent. Vrail pressed on. We attempted communication on all standard frequencies. We received a response on a frequency we do not use. It took our linguists 19 hours to decode it. He looked around the chamber. The representatives of 31 species were watching him. The message was, we have been waiting for the right moment. We are ready now. The Lyrian ambassador, a tall, thin creature whose species had held council membership for 3,000 years, raised one of her delicate hands. What species sent this message? Vrail pulled up the second file. It contained a spectrographic analysis of the ship's hull materials. It contained energy readings that their instruments barely had the range to measure, and it contained one identifying marker that his science team had found buried in the communication signal, encoded like a watermark. He put it on screen. A flag, blue and green and white, a small globe held in olive branches. That is impossible, said the Lyrian ambassador. Yes, Vrail agreed, and yet. The human name was Commander Yara Solis, and she was sitting in the captain's chair of the Endurance, a ship that was, by every technical definition, older than written language. Not her written language, not human written language, any species written language anywhere. The Endurance had been built 14,000 years ago. It showed none of that age. Its hull was seamless and dark, made of a material that did not exist in any council database. Its engines ran on a principle that most of the galaxy's physicists still could not describe. Its interior smelled faintly of metal and recycled air, the way ships always smell, because the humans inside it had made it smell that way. Had brought coffee machines and worn blankets and arguments about music, and had made the ancient alien ship into something that felt, improbably, like home. Yara was 38 years old. She had spent 22 of those years aboard ships like this one. She had never been to Earth. Nobody had for a very long time. Earth was a story now. Earth was something you told children at night when the ship's lights dimmed and the stars outside the viewport were too far to count. Earth was a wound that her people had decided, collectively, to carry quietly instead of bleeding out. She was looking at a display showing the Galactic Council's outer scanner network. Their signals were spiking. Their communications were burning. She could see the panic from here, rippling outward from the Veth corridor like a stone dropped in still water. "Good. They see us," said First Officer Dakarai Osai from her left. He was a big man, calm in the way that people who have lived their whole lives in contained spaces tend to be calm, practical, and unflappable, and always thinking 3 steps ahead. "They see 11,000 of us," Yara said. "They don't know about the rest." Dakarai smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who had been waiting a very long time for this particular morning. The rest was not a small number. The hiding had started 46 years ago, 2 years before the Council had come to survey the Sol system and found it dead. They had found it dead because humanity had made it look that way. It had taken 70 years of preparation, 70 years of a plan that had been voted on in secret, built in secret, maintained in secret, across a species of 12 billion people spread across dozens of worlds. The most complex logistical operation in human history, which was saying something, because human history was full of extraordinarily complex logistical operations, most of them involving people doing things that other people had told them were impossible. The plan had a name. It had been named in the original planning documents, drafted by a committee that had a gift for understatement. They called it the waiting. The waiting had begun because humanity had seen what was coming, not in some mystical, prophetic sense. In the precise, data-driven, deeply unromantic way that humans tend to see things when they are frightened enough to pay attention. They had seen the Keth expansion. They had seen what happened to species that had resources the Keth wanted and did not have the military force to protect them. They had seen the Council's response to those disappearances, the thin paragraphs, the catalog numbers, the moving on. And humanity had made a decision, the way humanity tends to make decisions when its back is against a wall. They got creative. The ships had been found in the dark. Not dark like shadow, dark like the space between galaxies, the void so empty that even light felt lonely passing through them. There were places in the universe where nothing had happened for billions of years, where the fabric of space was smooth and undisturbed and cold in a way that had no name in most languages. The first human deep range explorer, a ship called the Santiago, had found the derelict 312 years ago. It had been drifting, powerless, dark, a shape that the pilot, a woman named Emeka Osaibansu, had at first mistaken for a particularly large asteroid. She had approached it out of professional obligation. She was cataloging gravitational anomalies in the void. This thing, whatever it was, registered as an anomaly. It was not an asteroid. It was a ship, or it had been a ship. Its engines were cold and its hull was scored with damage that looked very old, and its interior, when Emeka finally worked up the nerve to dock and walk inside, was completely empty. No bodies, no cargo, no indication of what species had built it or where they had gone. Just the ship, vast and silent and waiting. Emeka Osaibansu sent a signal back to the nearest human outpost. The signal took 11 months to reach anyone. By the time a science team arrived, she had mapped the interior, all 47 kilometers of it on foot, with a flashlight and a portable oxygen unit, and the specific kind of stubborn curiosity that tends to appear in people who choose to spend their lives alone in the void. She had also found something she had not reported in her initial signal, because she had not yet understood what she was seeing. In the deepest chamber of the ship, a room the size of a small city, its ceiling lost in darkness, she had found an engine. Not a cold engine, a sleeping one. It hummed, barely, a frequency so low it was more feeling than sound. She had sat beside it for 6 hours before she realized the hum was getting slightly stronger, that it was responding to her presence, that something in this machine, something 14,000 years old, was waking up. The science team that arrived 11 months later brought with them 12 physicists, 9 engineers, 4 xenoarchaeologists, and a psychologist named Dr. Yusuf Adesanya, who had been included because someone in mission planning had decided that making first contact with a sleeping alien engine warranted mental health support. Dr. Adesanya turned out to be the most important person on the team. He was the one who noticed that the engine did not just respond to presence, it responded to intention. The other scientists were running tests, measuring, analyzing, debating, being scientists, which is a process that involves a great deal of careful and productive disagreement. The engine's hum remained at a low, steady register. Adesanya walked into the chamber alone. He stood in front of the engine, which was a curved wall of dark material 300 meters high, and he said, out loud, feeling slightly foolish, that he wanted to understand it. The hum rose 2 full octaves. He reported this to the team. The team was, as scientists tend to be when presented with data that does not fit their models, extremely skeptical. Then every member of the team went into the chamber, one at a time, and stood in front of the engine. The hum rose every time, different frequencies for different people, different intensities, as if the engine was reading something in each of them and responding to what it found. The xenoarchaeologist who had spent her career documenting dead civilizations went in last. She stood in front of the engine for a long time. When she came out, her face was the color of old paper. "It's not an engine," she said. "It's a library, and I think it's been waiting for someone to come and read it." Yara Solis had grown up hearing this story. Every human child did. It was the founding myth of the waiting, the moment humanity had found the inheritance. 11,000 ships, scattered across the dark voids, each one drifting, silent, preserving itself across millennia with technology that human engineers had spent 200 years carefully, painstakingly, reverently learning to understand. The species that had built them was gone, completely gone. No one knew their name. No one knew what they had looked like. They had left no record of themselves except the ships, and even the ships told only part of a story. A people so advanced that their greatest works of engineering were also their greatest works of philosophy, and so humble that they had left their inheritance in the dark for anyone to find instead of marking it with a monument. Humanity had found all 11,000. It had taken 40 years of searching, of following the faint gravitational signatures, of sending small ships with quiet engines into the deepest dark. They had found them all. And then they had hidden themselves. On the Endurance, Yara stood up from her chair. The display showed the Council's communications burning hotter now. More signals, more panic. She could imagine the meetings being called, the databases being checked, the thin paragraph on species 7742 being pulled up and read and found absurdly inadequate. She walked to the viewport. Outside, in the violet dark of the nebula, she could see her fleet. Not all of it. You could not see all of it from one viewport on one ship. The fleet was too large for that. But she could see enough dark shapes moving with quiet purpose through the gas clouds, enormous and unhurried, like whales crossing an ocean they had always known. Her people, in their inherited ships, old as God and running on something close to it. "Ready?" Dakarai appeared at her shoulder. He handed her a coffee, because Dakarai had been her first officer for 8 years and knew that she functioned better with coffee, and he was the sort of man who paid attention to the things that kept the people around him functional. She took it, drank it, looked at the fleet. "They're going to ask us where we've been," she said. "Let them ask," Dakarai said. "They're going to ask what we want. Let them wonder." She looked at him. He was looking at the ships, the same way she was, the same expression, something between grief and pride and a kind of cold patience that comes from being raised on a story about a very long wait that was finally, after 43 years of being dead, coming to an end. "What do we want?" she said, not to him, mostly to herself. The answer was simple. It had always been simple. It had been simple since the first planning committee had sat in a room 70 years ago and written the word waiting at the top of a document and begun. They wanted their dead back. They wanted Earth. The coffee was hot, the ships were old, the council was panicking. And humanity, extinct for 43 years, was done waiting. The council chamber smelled of fear. Every species in the galaxy expressed fear differently. The Lyrian went pale and still, like carved glass. The Torathi clicked their mandibles in a rapid, involuntary pattern they could not control. The Keth, Ambassador Vrail and his delegation, sat very straight and breathed carefully through their secondary gill slits, which meant they were working hard to appear composed and failing at it. Counselor Marath of the Dawn, who was the oldest serving member of the body and who had seen enough crises to recognize one by its smell, watched all of them from her seat at the high end of the chamber's curve. She was small and gray, and had the kind of face that had stopped showing surprise several centuries ago. She had lived through the Keth border wars, the Torathi schism, the plague of unmaking that had killed a third of the Council's member species before the Lyrian had developed a counteragent. She had never seen 31 species panic simultaneously. It was, she thought, almost interesting. "We need to know if they are a threat," said Ambassador Vrail. He had recovered some of his composure. 4 hearts helped. 11,000 ships of that scale with unknown capabilities. 13,000, said a voice. The chamber went quiet. The voice had come from the communication array. It was human. Low, female, unhurried. It spoke the council's trade language with a clean, precise accent that most of the chamber's members had never heard before, a human accent, which none of them had encountered in 43 years, and which sounded now like something half-remembered from a history file. Vrail's hands tightened on the table. "Who is speaking?" "Commander Yara Solis, United Earth Defense 7th Armada." A pause. "Although I should correct that title, Earth isn't technically ours yet. We're working on that." Marath leaned forward slightly. United Earth Defense. She had read about that institution in an old file. It had been a military organization, a small one. The humans had not been a militaristic species, not particularly, not compared to the Keth or the Torathi. They had maintained a defense force the way most species maintained one, because the galaxy was large and not always kind. She pulled up the original file on species 7742, while Vrail was still searching for words. The paragraph was exactly as thin as she remembered. Species 7742, humans Homo sapiens. Carbon-based, bipedal, single planet of origin Sol III. Brief period of interstellar expansion, estimated 200-year window. Technological classification, Tier 4. Diplomatic classification, non-hostile. Status, extinct, confirmed survey stardate 8841.7. Tier 4. She looked at the star map showing 13,000 ships, each one larger than most Tier 4 species ever managed to build. The file was wrong. The file was spectacularly, comprehensively wrong. "Commander Solis," Marath said, overriding the chamber's protocol because she was old enough that nobody argued with her about it anymore. "I am Counselor Marath. I would like to ask you a direct question." "Counselor," the voice was respectful, cautious, but not afraid, "please. We classified your species as extinct 43 years ago based on a survey of your home system. The planet was dead. The atmosphere was destroyed. There was no biosignature consistent with your biology." She paused. "What happened to Earth?" A long silence, long enough that Vrail made a gesture of impatience. "Then the Keth happened to Earth." In the Endurance's briefing room, Yara sat at the head of a table with 11 of her senior officers. The communication link to the council was open. On the wall screen she could see the chamber, the alien faces, the panic they were trying to control, and in the back row, very still, the Keth delegation. Vrail, she knew his name, she knew his face. She had studied him and every ambassador who had preceded him, and every Keth military commander of the last century, the way you study a problem you intend to solve. "Commander," said Vrail's voice, tight and controlled, "that is a serious accusation." "It's not an accusation," Yara said. "It's a report." She nodded to her communications officer, a young man named Rin who had grown up on one of the deep void stations, born aboard a ship, never having stood on planetary ground in his life. He pulled up the file and transmitted it to the Council's array. 40 years of surveillance data. Keth military movements in the sectors adjacent to Sol. Intercepts of Keth command communications, recorded carefully, preserved carefully, stored in duplicate in the memory banks of 12 different ships so that no single disaster could erase them. Energy signatures matching Keth atmospheric weaponry, applied to Earth's upper atmosphere over a period of 11 days. Before the humans had hidden. Before they had gone into the dark. While most of humanity was still on planets, still living ordinary lives, still buying groceries and arguing with neighbors and falling in love, the people running the Waitings Planning Committee had known this moment was coming. They had positioned surveillance equipment. They had watched. They had recorded everything. The council chamber was very quiet while it processed the data. The decision to survive had not been a simple one. Yara had not been alive for it. Her mother had not been alive for it. Her grandmother had been 7 years old when the vote was held, the strangest vote in human history, distributed across every human population in the settled systems, a choice presented in plain language to every adult human being. "We have found something. We have a way to survive what is coming. But it will cost us everything we have and everything we know. We will lose our worlds. We will live in the dark. We may never come back. Do we do this, or do we stand and fight and die?" The vote had taken 3 months to collect. The result had been 71% in favor of the waiting. That meant 29% had voted against it. Nearly 3 billion people who had said, in effect, that they would rather fight. What the Waitings architects had not fully anticipated was what those 3 billion people would do. They had expected resistance. They had planned for some level of civil disruption. What they had not expected was that most of those 3 billion people would, when told the plan in detail, when shown the ships, when shown what humanity had found and what it meant, change their minds. Not all of them. Some had refused. Some had stayed on their worlds. Some had died on Earth when the Keth came, or on the other human planets the Keth had quietly sterilized over the following decade, picking off the human presence in the galaxy the way you might clear a garden of a plant you did not want spreading. Those people were not forgotten. They were the weight that the waiting carried. They were why 71% had become, over 40 years, something that felt much closer to 100%, a species unified by a particular kind of grief that had nowhere to go but forward. "The data is being reviewed," Counselor Marath said. "You understand that this will take time." "We've been waiting 43 years, Yara said. "We can wait a little longer." Marath studied the human woman on the screen. She was young, mid-30s by the biological charts in the file. She had a composed face, brown and angular with eyes that did the thing that human eyes sometimes did in old video recordings. A quality of attention that felt, to species who had fewer nerves in their visual cortex, slightly unnerving, like being looked at rather than looked toward. "Where have you been?" Marath asked, not as a council question, as a personal one. Yara looked at her. Something shifted in her expression. The composure remained, but behind it briefly something else. "The dark," she said. The dark had a texture that nobody talked about in recruitment briefings. It was not simply the absence of light. Light was easy to manage. Ships had lights. Ships had screens and displays and the warm orange glow of occupied cabins and the blue flicker of engine monitoring stations. You could fill a ship with as much artificial light as you wanted. The dark was the distance. The void stations, the habitats that humanity had built in the spaces between stars, in the gravitational wells of dead systems and the shadow sides of rogue planets, were scattered far enough apart that you could spend months between them. The ships moved between them in rotation. Families were spread across distances that made the old interplanetary separations look like walking across a street. Children grew up knowing the names of cousins they had never met. Grandparents died on stations they had never visited. People fell in love over communication delays of weeks and maintained those relationships across distances that would have broken most species, because human beings had a particular capacity for abstract emotional attachment that the Council's xenopsychologists had noted in their files, and then largely failed to understand the implications of. The implications were this: you can scatter humans across an entire galaxy, and they will still somehow feel like one people. They will still argue about the same things. They will still share the same jokes, mutated and evolved across generations. They will still name their children after grandparents they never knew and cook food from planets they have never visited and carry, in the very specific way that humans carry things they cannot put down, the full weight of what they lost. 43 years is a long time. It is also, for a species that had been preparing for it, barely a beginning. The data review took 6 hours. Yara spent them in her cabin, which was small and contained a bunk she had slept in for 8 years, and a small shelf of physical books, paper books, an eccentricity, and a photograph she had printed from a file, because you cannot bring a photograph of a place that does not exist when you are born. The photograph showed Earth. Specifically, it showed a coastline, somewhere in what had been called Portugal, according to the caption. Blue water, white cliffs, a sky the color of something she had never seen outside of photographs because she had been born in the dark and grown up in the dark, and the only sky she had ever known was the inside of a ship's viewport. She looked at the photograph the way she always looked at it when she needed to remember what the waiting was for. Dakarai knocked and entered without being invited, because they had an arrangement about knocking that was more courtesy than boundary. Council's finished the data review, he said. And they're not disputing it. He sat in the one chair the cabin contained. The Keth are disputing it, but nobody seems to be listening to the Keth right now. Yara set down the photograph. What are they saying? Marath wants another call. She wants to know what we want. He paused. She used those exact words, like she already knows the answer is complicated. It is complicated. Or it's very simple, and the complication is that they don't want to give it to us. Yara stood up, rolled her shoulders, thought about Portugal. Set up the call, she said. The second call was different from the first. The first had been a surprise. This one was a negotiation, or the beginning of one, and every species in the council chamber had had 6 hours to settle their fear into something more functional: calculation, primarily. The galaxy ran on calculation. The data appears to be genuine, Counselor Marath said. She said it carefully, which meant she was being careful. The council takes this matter very seriously. That's good, Yara said. However, we must address the current situation. You have 13,000 warships positioned at the border of Keth space. This is. They are not warships, Yara said. Marath paused. They are defense vessels, Yara said. They have never fired on another species in the time they have been in our care. They were not built for war. We didn't build them at all, in fact. She let that sit for a moment. We found them. The chamber absorbed this. Found them, the Torathi ambassador repeated. His mandibles clicked once involuntarily. In what sense? In the sense that they were drifting in the dark between galaxies, built by a species that no longer exists, and my people spent 40 years finding every single one of them, learning how they work and making them ours. She paused. 13,000 ships. Every crew member aboard them was born in the dark. None of them have ever seen a planet from the surface. They are, she searched for the right word, patient. The word landed in the chamber like a stone in water, because the implication was not subtle. Patient people do not become less dangerous with time. Patient people wait until the moment is exactly right. What do you want, Commander? Marath said. Yara looked at the camera. She looked at Vrail, the Keth ambassador, who was sitting very still with his four hearts doing whatever four hearts do when they are simultaneously afraid. She thought about the photograph, the white cliffs, the impossible blue. "We want Earth restored," she said. "We want the other human worlds restored. We want the Keth held accountable by this council for what was done, on the record, formally, with consequences. And we want our people, the ones who survived on their own in the sectors, the ones who hid on Keth fringe worlds and lived underground for 40 years, we want them home." "And if the council cannot meet these demands," Vrail said, unable to stop himself. Yara looked at him for a moment. "Counselor Vrail," she said, "you have seen our ships, you know how many there are. You know we have been managing 11 years of population growth aboard them, which means our crews are not tired. They are young. They have grown up being told one story." She paused. "Let me be very clear about what I am not doing. I am not threatening this council. I am making a request, but I want you to consider the request carefully." Marath was watching her, the old gray counselor with the unshockable face. "We are considering it," Marath said. "Good," said Yara. "I'll wait." She cut the signal. In the chair beside her, Dakarai let out a breath that was not quite a laugh. "You told the Galactic Council you'd wait," he said. "We're good at it," Yara said. Outside the viewport, the fleet moved through the nebula, patient, enormous, old as the dark between stars. Waiting, as it always had, for the right moment to end. The Keth had a saying, "Power does not need to explain itself." Ambassador Vrail had believed this for all of his 340 years of life. He had watched the Keth Empire expand across 43 star systems and absorb 17 species without formal conflict, simply by being the largest and most organized presence in any room they entered. He had watched species do the math and make the sensible choice, and accept Keth oversight with the quiet pragmatism of those who understand that walls do not move just because you push them. He was doing math now. The math was not going well. He sat in the Keth delegation's private chamber, attached to the council complex like a cyst on the side of something larger. Around him were 6 advisors and 2 military liaisons. The military liaisons were there because 48 hours ago this had seemed like a routine border incident. They were still there now, but their function had shifted from advisory to something closer to what Vrail thought of privately as moral support. "What do we know about the ship's weapons capabilities?" he asked. The senior military liaison, a young officer named Teth, brought up a display. Teth was thorough and good at her job and visibly frightened in the way of people who are good at their jobs and have therefore correctly assessed what the data means. "Almost nothing," she said. "We cannot scan the hull material, our sensors return no useful data. The energy signatures are not consistent with any drive or weapons system in our database. Based on the scale of the vessels alone, if they carry conventional armaments at equivalent ratios to our own warships." "They don't need conventional armaments," Vrail said. Teth looked at him. 60-kilometer ships, he said. "Moving at that speed, do the kinetic math." Teth did the kinetic math. The color drained out of her face in the specific way of someone who has just realized that the problem is much larger than the category they put it in. "Yes," Vrail said. "So let us discuss what we know, not what we imagine." What they knew. The humans were alive. They had been alive for 43 years in circumstances that should, by all prior analysis, have broken them. They had found and apparently mastered ships built by an unknown species that predated the Council's oldest records. They were present in numbers that made the Keth military look, by comparison, like a regional police force. And they had presented to the Council, in 6 hours of data review, what appeared to be a complete and verified record of the Keth's action against the human home system. "The Council is going to convene a formal inquiry," Vrail said. "Yes," said his senior advisor, an old woman named Pesh who had been managing Keth diplomacy for 200 years and who currently looked like she was revising every lesson she had ever taught. "The data is very thorough." "How thorough?" 40 years of thorough, Pesh said. Commander, they recorded everything. The authorization codes, the fleet movements, the atmospheric dispersal sequences. They have flight logs from our vessels. They have communication records from our command structure. She paused. They have names. Vrail closed his eyes, just for a moment. 40 years, he said. They were meticulous, Pesh said. There was something in her voice that was not quite admiration and not quite horror, sitting exactly in the uncomfortable space between the two. Everything recorded, preserved, duplicated across multiple storage systems. They knew they would need evidence. They knew from the beginning that this moment would come, and they prepared for it. Vrail opened his eyes, looked at the display still showing the human fleet, sitting in the Veth corridor, patient as geology. 40 years, he said again. Different inflection, something else in it now. Yes, Pesh said. They didn't just survive, he said. They built a case. Pesh nodded slowly. Get me the Council's legal framework for species-level crimes, Vrail said. I need to know exactly what we are facing. He already knew it was not good. The thoroughness of the human evidence told him that they knew it too, had known it for 40 years, had built their entire return around it. He had a feeling that the humans had not just been waiting. They had been preparing to win. Marin was 61 years old and had lived every one of those years aboard ships. She was not crew. She was not military. She was a botanist, which was an occupation that made most people on the void stations look at her with a kind of soft bafflement, because growing things was an act of extraordinary optimism when you lived in recycled air and artificial light, and Marin had always found the bafflement encouraging. She liked being the person in the room whose hope was most visible. She kept a garden in a compartment that she had converted, with official permission and 3 years of paperwork, from storage to a small climate-controlled growing space. It contained tomatoes, herbs, a climbing bean that had to be trimmed twice a month, and one small tree. The tree was important. It was an olive tree, slow-growing, stubborn, difficult to keep alive in artificial light. She had kept it alive for 26 years. It was her grandmother's tree, grown from a cutting of a tree her grandmother had kept, grown from a cutting of a tree that had come from Earth. Marin did not think of this in sentimental terms. She thought of it in botanical terms. The tree was a continuous living line stretching back to a place that no longer existed. It was, in a small way, the only piece of Earth still alive anywhere. She was in the garden when the announcement came through the ship's communication system. It was Captain Reyes, the commander of their ship, the Sao Paulo, speaking in the careful, controlled voice that commanders used when they were managing their own emotions while speaking to 4,000 people. The Council has agreed to convene a formal inquiry into the Keth action against human-inhabited space, he said. This will take time. Negotiations are ongoing. A pause. But the Council has also issued a preliminary statement recognizing humanity's legal status as a living species under galactic law. We are no longer classified as extinct. Marin sat down on the floor of her garden, next to the olive tree. She put her hand on its narrow trunk. She could feel the bark under her fingers, rough and real and alive. Around her, through the ship's walls, she could hear the sound of 4,000 people receiving the same news. It was not one sound. It was many sounds layered, shouts and crying and laughter and complete silence all existing simultaneously, because 4,000 people are 4,000 different sets of 43 years, and they receive the same moment through all of them at once. She did not cry. She pressed her forehead against the olive tree and stayed like that for a while. Her grandmother had planted the first cutting from a cutting from a cutting because, she had said, the day would come when they went home, and when that day came, they would need a tree to plant there. Marin was still holding the trunk when her daughter appeared in the doorway. Her daughter was 19, born on this ship. She had never heard a bird or felt wind or stood in rain, because none of those things existed on the Sao Paulo. She was looking at her mother on the floor next to the olive tree with an expression that Marin could not immediately read. "Mom," her daughter said. "Give me a minute," Marin said. "Okay," her daughter said. She sat down on the floor too, cross-legged next to her mother next to the tree. She did not try to explain her expression. They sat like that for a while. It was enough. The inquiry took 4 weeks. Not because the evidence was unclear. It was entirely clear. The human data package was, as Counselor Pesh had observed, 40 years of thorough enough that the council's legal department had stopped trying to find gaps and begun simply cataloging what they had, because the catalog was already larger than most formal cases they had ever processed. The 4 weeks was the time it took for the council to do what large bodies of cautious beings do when presented with an outcome they cannot avoid but would prefer to approach gradually. They argued. They deliberated. They formed subcommittees. They requested additional testimony. They asked Commander Solis to appear before them 3 separate times and asked her variations of the same questions, which she answered each time with the same unhurried precision. They called experts. They reviewed the ancient records, the ones that predated the council itself, looking for precedents. They found a few, all of them partial, none of them comparable. Because this had not happened before. A species had never faked its own extinction, survived in secret for 2 generations, and returned with a fleet that made every other military force in the galaxy look like a collection of children's toys. The council was not stupid. Every member of it could count. They knew what the fleet represented. They knew that the outcome of the inquiry was not, in any practical sense, in doubt, not because the evidence was overwhelming, though it was, but because of the 13,000 ships sitting patiently in the Veth corridor. Nobody said this out loud. That was the nature of these things. But the Lyrian ambassador said something in a closed subcommittee session that got repeated in various forms around the chamber. She said, "We should consider that the humans came to us. They could have gone elsewhere first." She let that sit. The implication sat with it. The humans had chosen to approach the council. They had chosen law over force. That choice deserved a response in kind. Yara received the preliminary finding in her cabin at 300 ship time, when she was awake, because she had stopped sleeping more than 4 hours at a stretch about 3 weeks into the negotiations, and had not yet found a way back. She read it twice. The council found that the Keth Empire had conducted unauthorized atmospheric action against Sol III, resulting in the destruction of its biosphere and the deaths of an estimated 1.2 billion humans who had not been evacuated prior to the event. That the Keth Empire had conducted subsequent sterilization actions against 6 additional human-settled systems over a 10-year period. That these actions constituted a species-level crime under Articles 7 and 12 of the Galactic Compact, which had been in force for 2,000 years and which the Keth had signed. That humanity, as a surviving species with documented continuity of population and governance, retained all legal rights and territorial claims under galactic law. That Earth and the other human worlds were legally human territory, and their restoration was a matter of council obligation. She set down the document. Outside the viewport, the nebula had begun to clear. The Endurance had moved slightly in the last week, following the fleet's gradual repositioning. The violet gas had thinned. Through it, for the first time in the week she had been sitting here, she could see stars. Real stars. The stars of the inner galaxy, where the inhabited systems clustered, where civilizations had built their lives for thousands of years. The Keth Empire's stars, the Council's stars, the stars above worlds where billions of beings had never thought about the empty dark on their edges where something ancient was sleeping and a dead species was, quietly, not dying. She looked at them for a long time. Then she opened her communication channel to the fleet. "This is Commander Solis," she said. "All fleet commanders stand by for updated briefing. Broadcast this to all ships, all stations." She paused. "The Council has ruled in our favor. The legal framework is established." Another pause. She thought about how to say the next part, about what words were adequate for 43 years. She chose simple ones. "We are going home," she said. The fleet's response was not a military thing. It was not organized. It came back from 13,000 ships in 13,000 different shapes, voices and alarms and music, and someone on a ship she could not identify playing something she did not recognize on an instrument she did not know, something old and fast and full of feeling. It sounded like the galaxy had cracked open. She kept the channel open, let it all come through, did not move from the viewport. Let it last. Ambassador Vrail resigned his position that same day. He had been the Keth's ambassador to the Council for 60 years. He had done his job well by most measures. He had maintained relationships. He had managed the Keth's considerable political weight with consistency and what he had believed was appropriate care. He had not known about Earth. This was true, and also, he understood now, inadequate. He wrote his resignation in the old Keth formal style, because he had been raised to do things properly even when the things were difficult. He wrote that he was resigning because the Council's confidence in the Keth delegation had been damaged, and that a new representative would be better placed to navigate the political reality ahead. He wrote it carefully and said nothing untrue. He did not write what he was actually thinking, which was that he had shaken hands with the ghosts of a dead species at council meetings for 43 years and not known they were there, had filed reports on the stability of the human-free sectors, had built policy around the absence of humanity as a fixed point, had never once looked at the dark between stars and wondered what was in it. He cleared his desk. He picked up the small carved figure of a Kaveth bird that he had kept on his desk for 60 years, that his daughter had given him the day he had taken this position. He looked at it for a moment. He thought about 43 years, about 13,000 ships, about a woman in her 30s who had never seen a sky, raised on a ship, maintaining the particular patience of someone who knows that the thing they are waiting for is real. He put the bird in his pocket. He left. The restoration of a biosphere, it turned out, was not a simple thing. It was not impossible either. The Lyrian had done it 3 times in their 3,000-year history, and their technology for atmospheric reconstruction was considered the finest in the known galaxy. They had offered it, quietly, diplomatically, with the particular grace of a species that had learned when gesture mattered more than protocol 3 days after the Council's formal ruling. Councillor Marath had been the one to convey the offer. She had called Yara directly, bypassing the formal council communication channels in a way that was technically irregular, and that Marath was old enough to simply not care about. The Lyrian believe they can stabilize Earth's atmosphere in 18 months, she said. Full biosphere recovery would take between 40 and 80 years. They would be present for the whole process. Yara had been quiet for a moment. "Why are the Lyrian offering this?" she asked. Marath was quiet for a moment too. Then, "Because it is the right thing to do, and because the Lyrian take the long view, and in the long view, a species that survived what yours survived deserves neighbors who behave like it." Yara had accepted. There was no reason not to. There were many reasons to. The Lyrian science fleet had departed for Sol 3 days later, 17 ships carrying equipment that looked, to human eyes, like abstract sculpture, vast curved structures that unfolded as they moved, reaching out toward whatever they were meant to heal. The humans sent a delegation to accompany them. 12 scientists from the fleet, exobiologists, atmospheric chemists, ecologists, people who had spent their careers studying the life that had existed on Earth through records and samples and the descriptions of the dead, so that they could understand what was being rebuilt and help build it accurately. They were not the people who would live to see Earth finished. They were the people who would begin it. The Endurance traveled with the main body of the fleet toward human space. It was a long journey, weeks at the fleet's measured pace, and Yara used the time in ways she could not have used it before, when the waiting had been the only thing. She held meetings, real ones, not the crisis management and strategic communications of the negotiation period. Meetings about what came next, where the fleet's population would settle, how the void stations would be maintained, what the relationship between the ship-borne generation and the planet-borne settlements would look like as Earth became habitable again over the next 80 years. The ship-borne generation was, she found, a complication she had not fully anticipated. They were not going to want to live on planets. This was not a rebellion. It was not even a complaint. It was simply a fact about people who had grown up in enclosed spaces with recycled air and artificial light, and the particular rhythms of a ship, the change of shifts, the hum of engines, the way every person aboard was always approximately 40 meters from any other person, never truly alone, never truly in open space. They had built lives and loves and identities inside metal walls, and the idea of open sky was not, for most of them, a dream. It was a slightly terrifying abstraction. Her communications officer, Rin, had told her this directly when she had asked him what he was looking forward to. "Nothing really," he said. "I mean," he stopped, reconsidered. He was 24 and honest about his thinking in the way of someone who had never learned that you weren't supposed to be. "I want to see it. I want to stand on it. I want to say I've done it, but I don't think I want to stay." "Where would you stay?" she asked. He looked around at the bridge, the screens, the clean lines of the ancient ship's interior, with its human additions overlaid, the coffee machine, the handwritten crew rotation schedule pinned to the wall, the small cluster of photographs and personal items above the navigator's station. "Here," he said, like it was obvious. She thought about that for the rest of the day. There were humans who had not been part of the fleet. This was the piece of the story that the Council had not asked about, and that Yara had not offered, because it was complicated in ways that she was still processing. When the waiting had begun, the evacuation had not been perfect, nothing that large and complex and secret ever is. There had been people left behind, not by design, but by the particular friction of reality meeting plan. People in remote settlements who did not receive the signal in time. People who refused to go at the last moment. People who were in the wrong place when the transport windows closed. And people who had survived the Keth's actions, because they had gone to ground fast enough and small enough to be missed. The galaxy was large. The Keth were thorough but not infinitely patient, and searching every cave on every fringe world for individual human beings was not an efficient use of military resources. Some humans had hidden on Keth-adjacent worlds. Some had integrated carefully, quietly, passing for modified members of other species, or simply living in the unmonitored spaces that existed at the edges of any large empire. The Council's formal ruling had flushed them out, or rather, it had given them a signal that it was safe to stop hiding. The reports had started coming in 3 days after the ruling. Individuals, small groups, families. The oldest of them were people who remembered Earth, who had been adults when the Keth came and had spent 40 years living someone else's life in someone else's space, carrying a name they could not say out loud. The youngest of them had been born in hiding, had grown up being someone else. Some of them spoke no human language. Some of them had married into the species they had hidden among, had children who were half-human in ways that the galactic biological charts did not have good categories for. They were all coming. The fleet had diverted 3 ships to serve as transit vessels. It was not enough. It would never be enough for the first wave. Yara had requested Council assistance in coordinating the larger transit operation, and Marath had agreed without hesitation. The first group arrived aboard the Endurance 2 weeks into the journey. 47 people. A family cluster mostly, an extended network of 4 generations who had hidden on a Torathi fringe world for 40 years, running a small fuel processing operation that provided enough income to avoid scrutiny and enough isolation to avoid discovery. The oldest was 92. Her name was Adiz. She had been 49 when the Keth came. She walked aboard the Endurance in a Torathi worker's outfit that was too large for her small frame, and she stood in the ship's main corridor and looked around, at the ancient hull material, at the human lights strung along it, at the crew members who had stopped what they were doing to watch her arrive, and she did the thing that Yara had been told she might do by the psychologist who had briefed her before the arrival. She laughed. Not a happy laugh, not a sad one. Something that was both and also neither, the kind of sound that happens when a feeling is too large for any single category and the body just does the thing it can. Yara stepped forward. "Welcome home," she said, which was the only thing that felt right and also felt inadequate, because the Endurance was not home for this woman and neither was anywhere else yet. Adiz looked at her, looked at the ship, looked at the crew. "Your children," she said. Her voice was thin with age, but her eyes were sharp in a way that had survived 40 years of hiding intact. "Yes, ma'am," Yara said. Adiz looked at her for another moment. "Good," she said. "Good. The children should be the ones to do this." She let herself be guided inside. The Keth were being quiet. This was noted by several council members and by the Keth's own allies, of whom they had fewer than they used to. The council's formal inquiry had not just established human legal rights, it had also illuminated, for species who had preferred not to look directly at it, the nature of Keth expansion. 15 other species had filed requests for data review of historical incidents in their own borders. 3 of those reviews were already in progress. The Keth's new ambassador, a careful, formal individual named Sova, who had been selected specifically for her lack of connection to the previous administration's decisions, was spending most of her time in exactly the sort of meeting that Vrail had spent his last weeks avoiding, the meetings about consequences. The Keth were not going to collapse. They were too large for that, and the council had no mechanism for collapsing them, and none of the council's members wanted a destabilized Keth empire on their borders more than they wanted an accountable one. But the political cost of the inquiry was being paid slowly and continuously, in the form of trade renegotiations and border reviews, and the very specific social pain of being the species that everyone in the room is thinking about but not mentioning directly. It was, in the estimation of most observers, a fraction of what they owed. Sova was pragmatic about this. She had been a diplomat for long enough to understand that pragmatism was the only available tool in a situation you could not argue your way out of. She sent a personal communication to Commander Solis, carefully worded, formally appropriate, expressing the new administration's acknowledgement of the Council's findings and their commitment to the restoration process. Yara read it again. She wrote back one sentence: "Acknowledgement is a beginning." She did not know if it was enough. She did not know if anything was enough. She had learned in the 43 years of the waiting that justice and enough were not the same thing, and that the space between them was where most of actual life took place. The fleet reached the Sol system on a Tuesday. It was a Tuesday by the ship calendar, which kept Earth Standard Time because it had always kept Earth Standard Time, because one of the decisions made at the very beginning of the waiting was that the ships would stay synchronized to Earth even though Earth was gone, even though the time had no anchor, even though Tuesday meant nothing when there was no planet below you to put a Tuesday on. The Lyrian science fleet was already there. 3 of their ships were in high orbit, trailing the strange unfolded structures that were the beginning of the atmospheric restoration process. The structures caught the dim light of the sun and scattered it in ways that human instruments registered as beautiful and Lyrian instruments registered as functionally effective, which was the same thing. Earth itself was not yet visible. The ash cloud that had replaced its upper atmosphere 43 years ago was still thick, still blocking the surface from view. It would be months before the cloud began to thin, and years before anything could be seen clearly, and decades before anything could be grown. The fleet stopped at the edge of the system. 13,000 ships, holding position, looking at the sun of the world none of them had ever seen. Yara ordered all non-essential lighting aboard the Endurance dimmed. It was a ship-wide tradition that had started somewhere in the fleet's history. She didn't know exactly where or when, and had spread as traditions do, because the instinct behind it was correct. When you are looking at something that matters, you make the conditions right to look. In the dimmed light of the bridge, she looked at Earth's sun on the display. It was smaller than the suns of the system she had grown up near, yellow-white, ordinary-looking, nothing about it that would mark it as the sun of a story. Except that it was. Dakarai stood beside her, as he always did. He did not say anything. Dakarai had good instincts about when words helped and when they didn't. Over the ship's open channel, she could hear the fleet. Not words, just sound, the breathing of hundreds of thousands of people, all of them looking at the same ordinary yellow star, each of them carrying their version of what it meant. The photograph on her shelf, the olive tree in Marin's garden, Adi's laugh, the 3 billion who had voted no and then changed their minds, and the ones who hadn't, and the 1.2 billion who had not made it out, and the 47 people from the Torathi fringe world and the thousands more like them still making their way in from the edges of everything. She thought about Emeka Osaibansu, alone in the dark 300 years ago with a flashlight and an alien ship, walking toward a sound that was more feeling than sound, a hum that rose when she came near it. "Nav," she said. "Commander, take us in." The Endurance moved forward. Behind it, the fleet moved, not in military formation, not in any precise order. 13,000 ships in a vast loose cluster, moving toward a dead-looking star with the unhurried weight of something that has waited a very long time and is not rushing now. The Lyrian science team, watching on their instruments, recorded the approach. One of the Lyrian scientists, a young one on her first deep mission, who had not yet developed the even professional affect that experience would bring, turned to the colleague beside her. "How many are there?" she asked. The colleague checked the count. 13,407 ships, she said. Current population aboard, approximately 4.2 million people. "All of them," the young Lyrian said. "All of them came back." "Yes," her colleague said. The young Lyrian looked at the display showing the human fleet, the ancient dark ships, the people inside them who had been born in the dark and grown up patient and come here to look at a yellow star above a dead world. She had studied humans in school. The paragraph had been brief, a species that had briefly touched the stars and then gone quiet. She had not understood until now what quiet meant. Quiet was not the same as gone. Quiet was the sound of 13,000 ships holding their breath. The first human to stand on Earth in 43 years was not Yara Solis. It was Adi's. This had not been the plan. The plan, such as it was, involved a careful coordinated process, atmospheric readings, surface surveys, environmental testing, before any human set foot on the planet. The Lyrian scientists were very thorough about this. Their work in the upper atmosphere was proceeding, they said, better than projected, but the surface was still toxic. The ash that had settled over 4 decades had produced a soil chemistry that would kill most biology within hours. None of this was why they chose Adiz. Nobody exactly chose her. She chose herself. 3 days after the fleet arrived at Sol, she appeared in the Endurance's shuttle bay in a borrowed environmental suit that fit her badly. She was small even for a human, and the crew who suited her up had done their best with the available equipment, and stood in front of the shuttle's hatch with an expression that communicated, without a single word, that she was going down to the surface, and the question of whether anyone was going to stop her was purely theoretical. Yara was notified. She came to the shuttle bay and looked at Adiz. Adiz looked back. "It's not safe," Yara said. "I know," Adiz said. "The suit can handle the atmosphere, the toxicity of the soil." "I know," Adiz said again. "I'm 92. I have been hiding for 40 years. My husband died on that planet. My daughter was born on that planet. I had to leave her grave behind." She paused. "Yara, move." Yara moved. She went with her, took a suit herself, brought Dakarai and 2 others, because sending a 92-year-old woman alone to the surface of Earth in a suit that fit badly was more than she could reasonably do, even given Adiz's evident opinion of her own invulnerability. The shuttle descended through the ash cloud. It was like descending through a brown fog, dense and lightless and claustrophobic in a way that made Yara's chest tighten, because she was not a person who was comfortable with uncontrolled environments, having spent her life in controlled ones, and this was entirely uncontrolled. Then they were through it. And Earth was below them. It did not look like the photographs. The photographs showed blue and green and white. This was gray and brown and still, a surface scraped of almost everything, marked by the shapes of geography that had persisted, the curve of a mountain range here, the flat plane of what had been a sea floor there, the long line of a river valley emptied of its water. It was not beautiful in the way the photographs were beautiful. It was beautiful in a different way, which Yara could not immediately name and did not try to. They landed in a flat area that the Lyrian survey team had marked as structurally stable. The shuttle settled. The atmospheric readings were exactly as expected, survivable in the suits, but hostile without them. Adiz was out of the shuttle hatch before the landing ramp had fully extended. Yara followed, stood on Earth. It did not feel extraordinary in her feet. It felt like ground more give to it than a ship's floor, the faint uneven pressure of loose soil that had not been compacted by regular foot traffic. The gravity was slightly different than what she was used to. She had been briefed on this. 1G exactly, the standard that all human ships maintained, but the real thing, coming from below her instead of from a spin mechanism, felt different in some way she lacked the vocabulary to describe. She stood on Earth. Around her, gray distance and ash-colored sky and the distant shapes of old geography, and Dakari beside her, and Adiz ahead of her, moving with the slow, careful purpose of someone who has been waiting for this for 40 years. Adiz stopped. She turned back. She looked at Yara. "Where is Portugal?" she asked. Yara checked the navigation display on her suit's wrist. "Southwest, about 9,000 kilometers." Adiz looked in that direction, which was the direction of the horizon and nothing else. "My husband was from Portugal," she said. She said it very simply. Yara did not say anything. "We are going to plant olive trees here," Adiz said. It was not a question. It was not exactly a statement either. It was a kind of declaration, the way old people sometimes speak when they are not asking permission and not giving orders but saying something true. "Yes," Yara said. Adiz knelt down. In the gray soil of Earth, toxic and ash-heavy and not fit for growing, she pressed her gloved hand into it. She was 92 and kneeling on the surface of a dead world in a suit that didn't fit, and she pressed her palm into the ground and held it there. Yara watched her. There was nothing to say. The restoration took longer than 18 months for the atmosphere and longer than 80 years for the biosphere. These were the projections, and projections are outlines of what might happen if everything goes according to plan, which things rarely do. What actually happened was more complicated and slower, and occasionally more beautiful, and very often more difficult. The Lyrian were patient teachers. Their atmospheric scientists worked alongside the human environmental engineers who had been studying Earth's original ecological data for decades. And the combination produced something neither group would have produced alone, a restoration plan that was both technically rigorous and deeply personal, in the way that human involvement tends to make things personal. The first plants went into the ground 14 months after Adiz pressed her palm into the gray soil. They were not the first planned planting. They were a spontaneous thing. A group of ship-born teenagers who had come down on a surface survey team and had, against protocol, brought seeds. Nobody knew whose idea it was. Nobody was particularly disciplined for it, because the result, a small cluster of seedlings pushing up through the gray ash-streaked soil in a pattern that matched nothing except the teenager's impulse, was the first living thing on Earth in 43 years, and you do not discipline the first living thing. The seedlings were grass. Common grass, the kind that had grown on Earth in such abundance that nobody had ever thought to record its significance, the kind of thing you walk on without noticing. When the photographs were transmitted to the fleet, Yara saw people in the corridors of the Endurance stop walking to look at their personal displays, and then not move for a while. Grass on Earth alive. Small and stubborn and slightly wrong in color, the soil chemistry affecting the pigment, the Lyrian botanists noted, but alive. The question of what to do with the ships took years to fully resolve. There were humans who wanted to keep all of them. There were humans who wanted to return them to the dark from which they had come. There were humans who wanted to understand them better before deciding anything. These positions were argued at length, and with the particular intensity of a species that had been unable to have this argument for 43 years and had a great deal of stored-up opinion. The argument was never fully resolved. Most arguments aren't. What happened instead was what tends to happen with large things that people love and cannot agree about. The ships became many things to many people. Some remained active fleet vessels. Some became habitats, permanent stations in the dark between stars, the void communities that the ship-borne generation preferred and would not fully leave. Some were open to other species, because the Council's relationship with humanity had shifted in ways that were still being negotiated, and that included a certain degree of scientific exchange. The Lyrian, in particular, were fascinated by them. Their scientists spent years studying the hull material and the engines and the library nature of the drive systems, and they shared their findings with the human scientists, and together they produced a body of knowledge about the builders that was still only partial. A species 14,000 years dead leaves large gaps, but was no longer nothing. The builders had a name, finally. Not their real name, that was lost entirely, but a name that the joint Human-Lyrian research team agreed upon after long deliberation. They were called the Veth, after the corridor where the first human ships had been spotted re-entering the galaxy. It was a human suggestion, made with the logic that the Veth had given humanity their means of survival, and naming them after the place humanity returned through seemed right in a way that was difficult to articulate but generally felt true. This was the way many of the most important decisions got made in the years that followed, not through formal process or perfect logic, but through the particular human capacity for deciding that something felt right and then doing it. It turned out the galaxy was not entirely sure what to do with that. Yara stepped down as commander of the 7th Armada 4 years after the return. She was 42. In another era, this would have been young for retirement. In the current era, with humanity in the middle of the most logistically complex homecoming in recorded history, it was simply the right moment. The moment when the crisis management phase ended and the long, slow institutional phase began. And she was a crisis management person in her bones, not an institution-building one. She gave the command to her first officer. Dakarai accepted it with the same calm he accepted everything. She moved to Earth. This was her own surprise. She had not expected to want to. She was shipborne. She had told herself for years that she would not be among the ones who stayed on the surface, who needed the open sky. But she stood on Earth on a clear day. The atmosphere had stabilized enough for the cloud cover to thin, and there were days now when you could see the sky, and it was blue. Not everywhere. Not yet. The restoration was still underway. But in the right place at the right time of day, if you stood on the right hill, and she was standing on one in what had been Portugal, in the gray becoming green hills near a coast where the water was still wrong-colored, but was moving the way water was supposed to move. The sky above her was, unambiguously, blue. She stood on the hill and looked at it for a long time. She had seen photographs all her life. She had been prepared, she thought. She had known what blue sky looked like. She had not known what it felt like to stand under it. It was very big. She laughed a little, not at anything, just because it was so much larger than she had imagined. Behind her, she heard footsteps. Adiz, who had insisted on walking the hill despite being 93 now, and walking with a cane that sank slightly into the soft, recovering soil. She came to stand beside Yara. She looked at the sky. "It's smaller than I remembered," Adiz said. Yara looked at her, the sky. "The sky was bigger when I was a child," Adiz said. It always is. You remember things bigger when you've been away from them long enough. Yara looked back at the sky. It still seemed very large to her. She supposed it was all relative. The olive tree survived, Adiz said. She was talking about Marin's tree, the one on the Sao Paulo, the one kept alive through 3 generations of cuttings, the one that was now being propagated for ground planting. They are starting to put them in next week, in the valley. Yara nodded. She had read the report. My husband would have liked to see it, Adiz said. The simple statement of a fact she had been carrying a long time. Yara said nothing. The wind came off what had been the ocean and would be the ocean again, and it smelled of ash and distance, and underneath both of those things, very faintly, something alive. Adiz said, he would have liked you, I think. He liked people who were too stubborn for their own good. Is that what I am? You kept 13,000 ships in a nebula for 4 weeks waiting for a committee to make up its mind, Adiz said. Stubbornness is the polite word. Yara laughed. The galaxy had a new file now. Not species 7742, extinct. That file had been marked outdated and archived. The new file was longer, much longer. It had taken 3 council archivists working in rotation to write it, and even they acknowledged it was incomplete because you cannot fully document something that is still happening. The file described the discovery of 11,000 ships in the dark, the 40-year project of the waiting, the return, the council inquiry and its findings, the restoration of Earth ongoing. The file described the builders, the Veth, and what was known about them, which was still partial but no longer nothing. The file described the Keth accountability process, which was slow and politically complicated and imperfect, as such processes always are. The file described humanity as of its current date, 4.2 million aboard the fleet, another 800,000 confirmed survivors from fringe worlds and hidden communities, and an Earth in the slow process of becoming habitable again for a population that had never lived on it and was still, collectively, figuring out what that meant. The last line of the file had been written by Counselor Marath herself, who had taken the unusual step of adding a personal note to an official document, which the archivists had debated and then decided to keep, because Marath was old enough that nobody argued with her about it. It read, a species that endures through patience and ingenuity, that chooses law over force when law is available and force when nothing else is, that carries its grief without being destroyed by it. This species is not simply a catalog entry. It is a lesson. The Council would do well to study it. The file was marked active. Status living. On the hill in Portugal, Yara and Adiz stood under the blue sky for a while longer. There was no urgency to move. The urgency that had run through Yara's life for 4 years, the negotiations and the fleet management and the daily decisions that carried the weight of 4.2 million people, had not disappeared. It was just not required in this moment. This moment did not require anything except being in it. The wind shifted, carried with it from the valley below the smell of turned earth, real earth being planted. It is going to be a long time before this looks like anything, Adiz said. Yes, Yara said. 80 years, they say, for the biosphere, maybe longer. Probably longer. I won't see it. No, Yara said. But you might, Adiz said. You're young. Yara thought about that. Thought about what 80 years meant. About being 122 and standing on a hill that was green. About the olive trees that would be planted next week, growing slowly over decades into something a future person would walk past without thinking about. The way you walk past old trees without thinking that someone planted them, that someone made a decision one afternoon to put something in the ground that they would never see grown. She thought about Emeka Osaibansu, walking through an alien ship with a flashlight, drawn toward a hum that was more feeling than sound. About the 300 years between that moment and this one. About all the people who had made decisions for futures they would not inhabit. I might, Yara said, we'll see. Adiz nodded. She pressed her cane into the soft Portuguese earth and looked out at the gray becoming blue sky with the expression of someone who has been patient for a very long time and does not intend to stop now. Below them in the valley, the first olive trees were going in. Small, wrong-colored in the bad soil, stubborn in the way that things planted with intention tend to be stubborn. Taking root.